the hardware is nothing but the components of the computer that we can touch and feel can be called as hardware. The control unit performs the overall control of the system, whereas arithmetic and logic unit helps to perform all arithmetic operation as well as logical operation. Place where we are inserting additional devices on the back side of the CPU that can be called as port. The characteristics of motherboard, there are three characteristics. One is form factor, chipset as well as processor socket. Welcome back to one and all. Myself Vasanta, lecturer in computer science, Vidhyaashram, Pre-University College, Temple of Excellence, Mysore. Today we are going to start with the first chapter, that is the typical configuration of computer system. As per PU board syllabus, this is the first chapter. The total weightage you have in the annual exam, 6 marks. In part A, 1 question they will ask, and part B, 1 question, as well as in part C, 1 question they will ask in the annual exam. The easiest chapter. Only thing, in this chapter, you will study regarding what do you mean by motherboard, how exactly it is arranged, which are the components of motherboard. Regarding that, you will study. Whereas already I told you, the total weightage is 6 marks. In part A, 1 question. So in the final exam also, you will get only 1 question in part A, that is first question from this part A. There, they may want to ask regarding the expansion, what do you mean by slot, what do you mean by port, like that they will want to ask. Whereas in part B, they will ask the components. Whereas in part C also, they will ask the components. Whereas on this chapter, you will study regarding the block diagram of computer, introduction to motherboard, the characteristics of motherboard, as well as types of motherboard. Regarding that, you will come to know on today's sessions. Whereas first, we'll explain one by one. Whereas the block diagram, already you know what do you mean by hardware, software, computer. Regarding that, once again I'm going to recall and then I will explain the block diagram of computer. Whereas the hardware is nothing but the components of the computer that we can touch and feel can be called as hardware. The software is nothing but a set of instructions. It will perform specific tasks. When we come on block diagram of computer, in this we have input unit, then CPU, memory unit, as well as output unit. Then what is the use of this input unit? Input unit, or we can say it as input device. With the help of input device only, we can able to send the data to the computer. Then what is the difference between data as well as information? Data is a raw facts, figures and statistics. Whatever thing we are giving to the computer for processing purpose, that can be called as data. Whereas this input unit helps to give the command or data to the computer for processing purpose with the help of input devices like keyboard, mouse, monitor, OMR, MICR, all are some input devices. These input devices helps to give command data to the computer for the processing purpose. When the data is transferred from input devices to the CPU, that is central processing unit. Name itself suggesting central, it's the main part of the computer. Depending upon the type of CPU we are using, depending upon that only the computers are classified nowadays. Whereas central processing unit is a main part or a brain of the computer. In this CPU, we have 3 components like control unit, arithmetic and logic unit, as well as register. 3 components under central processing unit. Whereas the first one, control unit. The name itself suggesting that control. It will controls the overall operation. The name itself suggesting that it will controls the overall operation of the computer. When it has to give the command or when it has to produce a result, how to process, all the transactions are performed by control unit only. And the next one, arithmetic and logic unit. The name itself suggesting it will help to perform all arithmetic operation like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division mode, with that logical operators like AND, OR, NOT, all the operations helps to perform on this arithmetic and logic unit. Whereas input unit helps to give command data to the computer with the help of input device. Once it is passes to CPU, there in central processing unit, the control unit perform the overall control of the system. Whereas arithmetic and logic unit helps to perform all arithmetic operation as well as logical operation. With that, we have one more unit under CPU, that is register. Whereas register is a temporary storage unit and it stores the intermediate data. It is a high-speed temporary storage unit and it stores intermediate data. Then what do you mean by intermediate? Intermediate data is a thing, but the data which are produced at the time of processing, that data will also stored in this CPU. Then we have one more unit, memory unit. When they come on memory, we need memory for storage purpose. Whereas this memory will store both input data as well as output information. Whatever thing with the help of input device to the computer, that will also stored in the memory. After processing, whatever results we have generated, that results also stored in this memory. When they come on memory, two types we have. One is primary memory and one more is secondary memory. This memory is classified into two types. One is primary memory and one more is secondary memory. When they come on primary memory, it is a temporary memory, high-speed memory and it able to interact with the CPU. Whereas secondary memory is a not high-speed memory but it stores the data permanently. Whereas primary memory will not store the data permanently, whereas secondary memory stores the data permanently for future purpose. But this primary memory is a high-speed memory, whereas secondary memory is not a high-speed memory. Whereas this memory unit, whereas in this memory it is mainly used for storage purpose. In this we have two types, primary memory and secondary memory. Primary memory stores the temporarily, it will store all the data but it is very fast. Whereas secondary memory stores the data which are permanent by nature. And here when I performing any operation, first it will stored in primary memory. When I say the program on that time, the program or data, everything will stored on this secondary memory. Then you come to know what do you mean by input unit. Then CPU. The CPU is the brain of the computer. Three components. One is control unit, arithmetic and logic unit and one more is register. But memory is used for storage purpose, primary memory and secondary memory. And the next unit in the block diagram, that is output unit or output devices. Then what is the use of this output devices? This helps to give the result to the user. Who are the users? We are the users. Whereas input device helps to give the command or data to the computer with the help of input device. Whereas output unit helps to give the result to the user with the help of output device like monitor. Monitor acts both input device as well as output device. Whereas here also I can mention monitor is an input device as well as output device. Whereas speaker is an example for output device. Speaker, printer, plotters. These are the example for output devices. Now you come to know what do you mean by input device. Helps to give the command to the computer. That means data it can able to give. The examples for input devices are keyboard, monitor, mouse. All are example for input devices. Then when the data is transferred with the help of input devices to the CPU, the CPU is the main part. 3 units, control unit, arithmetic and logic unit as well as one more is that is the register. Whereas the control unit, the name itself suggesting that it will control the overall operations. Whereas arithmetic and logic unit helps to perform all arithmetic operation as well as logical operation. Whereas memory helps to store the data. Whereas when they come on memory, there are two types, primary memory and one more is secondary memory. Primary memory stores the data temporarily. For example, RAM, ROM, all we used to call it as primary memory. Whereas secondary memory, for that hard disk, floppy disk, pen drive, these are the example for secondary memory. Then here we have output unit. Output unit helps to give the result to the user. Whereas the example for output device, printers, speakers, plotters, monitors, these are the example for output device. This question they may want to ask for 3 marks. Explain the block diagram of computer. On that time you have to write the block diagram. Then each part you have to explain at least 1 or 2 lines regarding that. Now is it clear? Next, we will move on the motherboard. This is the general structure, how exactly the motherboard will see. When you open the CPU, inside that we can able to see the components of the motherboard. Now we will explain what do you mean by motherboard, how we required the motherboard, what are the major functions of motherboard. Regarding that, now we will explain it. The motherboard is alternatively known as main board. It's a main board, it's a main part of the computer. System board or planner board or logic board also we can call. Motherboard is a logic board or system board, like that we can able to call. And it is the main printed circuit board. If you see the diagram here, everything is printed in circuit format. That's why the motherboard is called as mainly printed circuit board found in the computers and other expandable systems. Mainly it is a printed circuit board. In the exam, if they ask, what do you mean by motherboard for 1 mark, then you have to mention it is a main printed circuit board in the system. Then it holds many of the electronic components. It holds all the components like SMPS, everything, all the components in this we have. Slots, ports, north bridge, south bridge, like that we have. It holds many of the electronic components of the system such as central processing unit. It contains CPU, memory unit for storage purpose and provides connectors for other peripherals. I can able to connect other additional devices also. The motherboard contains processor and other component mainly. Whereas if you see the figure here, it is a main circuit board. It is a printed circuit board. It contains all the components like here we have ports and here we have slots, north bridge, south bridge, all the components in the motherboard only it is mounted. Then the motherboard contains the processor and other components. Now when you see the motherboard acts as a glue which binds all the components together. Mainly it connects all the components and the main job is to coordinate with the various operations performed by various components. Like consider this motherboard contains microprocessor, connector, parallel, serial ports, everything it contains. Microprocessor, chipset, sound card, video card, controller, then expansion bus, memory sockets, RAM modules, cache memory, all those things in the motherboard it contains. That mainly thing here, it acts like a glue which connect all the components where it may be input device, output device, memory devices, anything, all the things mainly it will connect together. Next, when we come on the characteristics of motherboard, there are 3 characteristics. One is form factor, chipset as well as processor socket. This is important question. For 3 marks, usually they will ask this question. Explain the characteristics of motherboard. On that, I told you 3 forms. One is form factor, chipset as well as processor socket. Whereas form factor refers to the motherboard's geometry, dimension, arrangement and electrical requirements. How exactly the geometry of the motherboard, the dimension, the size of the motherboard, depending upon that also we can able to classify the motherboard. How much size it is, what is the dimension of that, how exactly it is arranged, depending upon that also we can characterize the motherboard. That is nothing but form factor. Next one, chipset. Whereas the chipset here, the functions of the chipset is to coordinate data transfer between the various components of the computer. How exactly in the chipset the data is transferring. Depending upon that also we are classify the motherboard. One, by using form factor, on which way it is arranged. So what is the dimension of that? Regarding that also we can classify. As well as chipset, how exactly the data is transferring. The functional chipset is coordinate data transfer between the components. Depending upon that also we are going to classify the motherboard. Then processor socket. The processor socket is a rectangular connector into which the processor is mounted vertically or square shaped connector. On which pattern, especially whether it's a vertical shape or it is in a square shape, how in which format it is mounted. Depending upon that also, we are classifying the motherboard. Three forms. One is form factor is very important. Then chipset, how data is transferring, how whether it is mounted vertically or horizontally. Depending upon that also, we are classifying the motherboard. It's a very, very important question. So many times in the annual exam, they ask this question. In 2022, there also they ask this question for 3 marks. That is form factor, chipset as well as processor socket. Next, we'll explain the types of motherboard. When they come on types of motherboard, this is also a very important question. They will ask this question for 3 marks. When they come on types, we have totally 4 types of motherboard. One is XT, then AT motherboard, baby AT, then ATX. As well as they will going to ask the expansion of this. What do you mean by XT, AT, ATX? That also you are going to get the question on this chapter. 4 types: XT, AT, baby AT as well as ATX. One by one now we will discuss. The first one is XT. XT stands for Extended Technology. So oldest one. This is the oldest motherboard, that is Extended Technology. In this we have processor sockets. What do you mean by sockets? Then what do you mean by ports? What do you mean by slots? Slot is nothing but the opening inside the motherboard. There we can able to insert the additional devices. Additional devices can be inserted for processing purpose. For example, consider you have monitor, the visibility, the pixel is not sufficient for you. Then when you want to increase the pixel capacity, then we are using the additional expansion card for video purpose. That can be inserted in slots. Whereas it contains processor sockets, then RAM slots for increasing the capacity of the RAM. For that purpose also we need this one, as well as ISA slot, industry standard architecture slot, whereas RAM slot, that is random access memory. Here that slot it contains. Slots is nothing but place. Consider here we have slots. This can be called as slots. There I can able to insert additional devices. On this particular place we can able to insert additional devices for increase the capability of the system. Whereas in this we have RAM slots, ISA slots, that is industry standard architecture slots, as well as 12-pin power connector in this we have, as well as no ports are there here. If you observe here, then this can be called as example for XT motherboard. Here example for that Pentium 1, Pentium MMX, Pentium 2, Pentium 2 processor. These are the few example for XT motherboard. If you see the structure, this is the structure of Pentium 2. Now is it clear? Next we will discuss about AT, that is Advanced Technology. This is the second type. Then what do you mean by this advanced technology? In this we have SD RAM slot. If you observe the previous, only we have RAM slot. But whereas here we have SD RAM slot, double data rate random access memory, synchronous dynamic random access memory. Like that we have several types of RAM. Under that we have double data rate synchronous random access memory, synchronous dynamic random access memory. Like that several types we have. Under that SD RAM slots we have, as well as ISA slots are there. Whereas here also ISA slots also there. Whereas here also ISA, that is industry standard architecture slots are there. PIC slots are there. PGA slots are there, as well as 20-pin power connectors are there. Then if you observe here, when they come on example for AT, there we have Pentium 3 processor is the example. Whereas here this is Pentium 2. Whereas here this is Pentium 3. This place used to call it as slots. Whereas here the place where we are inserting the additional devices, this place can be called as ports. There is a difference between slots and ports. Whereas slots are nothing but inside the motherboard, the place where we can able to insert additional devices or additional to increase the performance capability of the system, where we are connecting additional devices, that can be called as slots. This, whatever here, this is also slot, everything is slots. But when you come on here, the place where we are inserting additional devices on the back side of the CPU, that can be called as port. Whereas here, we have PGA sockets as well as 20-pin power connector. This is an example for Pentium 3. This is the example for ATX. Now, is it clear? Next, we will move on. The next one, Baby 80 motherboard. This is the third type. Whereas on this, it is a combination of XT as well as AT motherboard. It contains both the features, like whatever features in we have XT, that is RAM slot, ISS slot, 12-pin power connector, everything, as well as SD RAM, ISS slot, PIC slot, GPGA socket, everything is there in the Baby 80 motherboard. Here it is a combination of XT as well as AT motherboard, whereas it contains slots type processor socket. Mainly it contains slot type processor sockets as well as PGA processor sockets with that SD RAM slots, DDR RAM, that is double data rate, synchronous dynamic random access memory, as well as whatever different types of slots, all the things we can have, PIC slots as well as ISA slots, 12 as well as 20-pin power connector as there, as well as ports also there here. If you observe this, this is a Pentium 4. Example for Baby 80 is Pentium 3 as well as Pentium 4 because it contains both the combination of XT as well as AT. The last one is Advanced Technology Extended Motherboard. It's the last one, it's the latest one. This is a latest motherboard. It is a latest motherboard. In this, we have MPGA processor sockets are there. With that IDE interface, SATA connectors are there. We have additional features here. SD RAM slots are there. PIC slots, ISA slot, AGP slot, accelerated graphic ports. To increase the graphic performance, we need this accelerated graphic ports, ISA industry standard architecture, then PIC slots, 20 as well as 12-pin power connectors are there as well as ports are there. Example for ATX, that is Advanced Technology Extended Motherboard. Pentium 4, dual core 2, then all this i3, i5, i7 processor are the example for ATX. This is a dual core motherboard. Dual core motherboard. Now is it clear? The block diagram of computer, what do you mean by input devices, output devices or input unit, output unit, the general structure of CPU, then what is the use of memory, then how exactly the motherboard will look. Then what do you mean by motherboard? The motherboard is nothing but main printed circuit board. It will connect all the components of the computer. Mainly it will connect all the components like microprocessor, parallel processor, serial, parallel 8 bits at a time it will transfer, whereas serial 1 bit at a time it can transfer. Then regarding sound as well as video controller, expansion slot. What does it mean by expansion slots? What is the main use of expansion? Expansion slots as well as expansion ports are mainly used to expand the capability of the system, where it may be video card or it may be audio card or anything. Expansion is to increase the capability. All those things are connected in the motherboard. Then when they come on the factors, the characteristics, form factor, chipset as well as processor socket, mainly form as dimension. How exactly the dimension? The geometry of the motherboard. Whereas chipset, how exactly the data is transferring. Processor socket, on which way, whether it is a vertical or it is in a horizontal way, on which way it is mounted. Regarding that also, we will classify the motherboard. When they come on types, XT, AT, Baby 80 as well as ATX. XT, that is Extended Technology. AT, Advanced Technology. Baby 80 motherboard, it is a combination of XT as well as AT. And the last one is ATX, that is Advanced Technology Extended. It's the latest motherboard. These are the things you have studied on this class. Next class, we will explain the regarding which are the components on the motherboard. What do you mean by slots? What do you mean by ports? How it is connected? What is the main work of the slots as well as ports? Then how power supply will be given to all the components of the computer. Regarding that, you will come to know in the next class. Thank you for all of you.